She had found everything in that archive. Every treaty signed under false pretenses, every land grant backdated by a steward's forgery, every registry entry where a name had been scratched out and a new one inked above it. The original still legible if you knew how to hold the vellum to light. In 7 days, she had untangled 40 years of deliberate knots. The king's men had watched her with something she could not name. Not suspicion exactly, more like the look of people waiting for her to open a door they had all agreed not to mention. She did not understand then what she was missing. She thought the silence was respect for her work. She thought the only things hidden in that archive were the things she had already found. She was wrong about the file. She was wrong about why the king had hired her at all. In the year called the Iron Winter, when the river through Keld's Crossing froze so hard it cracked along the center and the sound carried 3 leagues in the cold air, a woman named Sable took a commission she could not afford to refuse. She was 23, daughter of a record keeper who had died with debts she had inherited along with his skill. She had spent 4 years copying documents for whatever Lord would pay, building a reputation for exactness that had nothing to do with beauty or rank or the bonds that made other women valuable in this part of the world. She had no wolf. She had never shifted. She wore the same gray wool coat to every appointment and kept her dark hair pinned back with a single iron clasp her father had left her. She was plain in the way plain people are plain, not unlovely, but unadorned. The kind of woman a room forgets, unless she has given it a reason to remember. The commission came through an intermediary, a man named Torm, who smelled of tallow, and delivered messages for 3 different packs without loyalty to any of them. 7 days, he said. The Keld Archive, full access, payment on completion. He set down a figure that made her hands still over the copying she had been doing, and she looked at it for a long moment before she said she would need ink and lamp oil included. Torm blinked. She waited. He agreed. She did not ask who had hired her. She assumed correctly that she would find out when she arrived. The Keld Archive occupied the east wing of a stone keep at the edge of the Pack's territory, where the hills went dark with pine and the wind came off the ridge already colder than it had any right to be. The outer walls were black with age. The gate guard was a woman named Esse, broad-shouldered and watchful, who checked Sable's letter of commission twice without embarrassment and then led her inside without speaking. The archive room itself ran the length of the wing, shelved from floor to ceiling, with 4 long tables in the center and a fireplace at the far end that produced more smoke than heat. It smelled of old vellum and iron dust and something sharper underneath. Something animal and ancient she filed away without naming. The first person she met in the archive was not the king. It was Aldrich, the head steward, who arrived the morning of her first day with the manner of a man who had prepared his face in advance. He was perhaps 50, lean, with a chain of office she recognized as heavier than his rank in a border keep should have warranted. He welcomed her with the wrong kind of warmth, the kind that wants something from you before you have had time to understand what you have. He told her the archive was in a state of some disorder following recent events, which he did not specify. He told her she had full access to all materials on the shelves and in the 3 locked chests, the keys to which he placed on the center table with a gesture that said he wanted her to notice the gesture. He told her if she had any questions, she should bring them to him. She thanked him and waited until he left before she began. The disorder was real, but not random. Someone had been moving documents, not in panic, not in haste, but in the patient way of someone who understood the system well enough to know where a moved paper would eventually be looked for and chose to put it somewhere adjacent. A good archivist would find it eventually. A mediocre one might not. Sable was not mediocre. She understood by the end of the first day that the apparent disorder was the concealment, and that the concealment was thorough enough to have taken someone months, possibly years, to build. She said nothing. She began making notes in the small leather book she always carried. in a shorthand her father had invented that looked like meaningless marks to anyone who had not been taught it. By the third day, she had found the land grants, 12 of them, covering holdings along the eastern ridge, all bearing the seal of the previous alpha. All dated inside a 3-month window 7 years ago. All showing when she held the vellum at the correct angle, a secondary impression beneath the official date. The ghost of an earlier mark that had been soaked off and repressed. The original dates were 2 years earlier, before the previous alpha died, before the succession. She sat with the grants for a long time, very still. Then she set them aside and kept working. By the 5th day, she had found the registry entries. 46 names scratched out and overwritten across 3 generations of pack records, all connected by a pattern she had to map in her notebook before she could see it. They were all connected to a single bloodline, a line the official records indicated had died out in a plague 43 years ago. The scratched names told a different story. Someone had not wanted that story told. She kept working. The locked chests contained ledgers. The ledgers contained payment records. The payments were made to intermediaries, most of them untraceable, but 4 of them recurring, 4 names she had seen elsewhere in the documents, in connection with border disputes and a treaty negotiated 12 years ago that had ceded 3 villages to a neighboring pack. She cross-referenced until the shape was clear. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling and thought about Torm and about the figure he had put on the table. A commission like that, for 7 days, for a single archivist with no rank and no bond, meant someone needed the work done quickly and quietly, and needed a result they could not get from anyone inside the keep. If you are still here with me, I imagine you are, because there is still the matter of the file she did not find. Stay close. What she did not yet understand was that someone had noticed exactly how good she was. On the evening of the 5th day, a man came into the archive. She heard him before she saw him. Not his footsteps, which were quiet for a large man, but the change in the room, a slight shift in the quality of the air, a pressure differential she could not have named as a physical fact, but registered as one. She looked up from the ledger she was cross-referencing. He stood in the doorway at the far end of the room, near the fireplace. He was taller than the doorframe required him to bend for, and he did not bend. He wore a dark wool coat with no visible insignia, and his hands were at his sides, and he was looking at her. She looked back. She noted the scar that ran from his left jaw to the corner of his eye, the kind of scar that did not come from an accident but from a specific kind of decision. She noted the stillness of him, the quality of it, not rest but coiled attention. She noted that the fire behind him was burning lower than it had been, and she had not added wood, and neither had he, and it should have gone out by now. She did not understand that last thing. She registered it and moved on. He said, "You found the land grants." It was not a question. She said, "I found several irregularities." He said nothing for a moment. She waited. She was accustomed to waiting. He crossed the room and came to the center table and looked down at the arrangement of documents she had laid out. He did not touch anything. He was close enough that she could have touched him if she had reached out, which she did not do. Something in her sternum made a sound she did not have a name for, a single low note that was not pain and not warmth, and was both of those things at the same time. She filed it and kept her eyes on his face. He said, "You are faster than I expected." She said, "I had good material to work with. Whoever organized this before me had a system. It was the wrong system, but it was consistent." He looked at her then, not at the documents, at her. She held the look because, looking away from people who were trying to read her, had never served her, and she had a rule about rules that served her. He said, his name was Aldrich, and left. She sat for a long time after the sound of his footsteps faded. Her chest was still making the low note. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and it stopped, or she stopped noticing it, which was not the same thing. She went back to work. She did not ask Essa who the man in the doorway had been. She already knew. She had known from the stillness and the air, and the way the whole room had quietly organized itself around him when he entered. The way a room does not do for stewards, no matter how heavy their chain of office. King Aldrath of Keld, scarred, widowed 4 years past, mateless since before that, if the registry entries told it true. What she did not know yet was why he had hired her specifically, or what he knew about what she would find, or what the one file he had not put on the shelves contained. On the 6th day, Aldrich came back. He came in the mid-afternoon when the light through the high windows had gone gray and she had lit the 2 lamps on the center table. He came with a second man she had not seen before, a younger man with a council recorder's bag over his shoulder and the expression of someone who has been given instructions he finds personally distasteful. Aldrich set both hands on the edge of the table and looked at her arrangement of documents. He said, "We'll need you to confirm the land grant records are in good order." She looked at him. She said, "In what sense?" He said, "The sense that they reflect the correct and valid grants as recorded." The young recorder uncapped his pen and looked at her with his head slightly down, ready. She looked at Aldrich's hands on the table. She looked at the documents between them. She understood exactly what he was asking. He was asking her to certify that the forgeries were originals, that the secondary impressions were artifacts of aging, that the scratched names in the registry had never held any significance worth noting. He was asking her to put her name on a document that would make the last 6 days of her work officially meaningless. He was asking because he had figured out that she had found everything, and because he did not understand, yet, what she would do about it. She said, "I'll need another day to complete my inventory." He said, "You have been thorough enough." She said, "I have not finished." The recorder looked up. Aldrich's hands pressed harder into the edge of the table. He said, with a measured pleasantness that was not pleasant, "The commission was for 7 days. You have 1 day remaining. I am offering to release you now, with full payment." She understood he was also offering something else. She said, "I have not finished." He left. He did not take the recorder with him. The recorder looked at her for a moment, then quietly repacked his bag and followed. The young recorder's name was Pell. She had not known that yet. She would learn it later, when it mattered. On the 7th day, she found the one thing she had not been meant to find, not because it was hidden better than the rest, but because it was hidden somewhere she had assumed was empty. One of the shelves on the east wall held a run of administrative ledgers from 30 years ago, and at the end of the run, behind a false panel she found only because the wood grain did not match, was a single folded piece of vellum tucked between the panel and the stone. The fold was tight and the vellum was old, but the ink was still clear. It was a registry entry. A single name, carefully struck through 7 times but preserved intact behind the false panel instead of destroyed, which meant someone had wanted it kept, just not found. The name was Sable. Her name. Her exact name, including the family notation, her father's designation, a marking she had only ever seen in his private documents, the ones he had burned before he died. She stared at it for a long time. The name above the scratch-out was a bloodline designation she had spent 2 days cataloging. A bloodline the official record said had ended in a plague. A bloodline she had been mapping because someone had spent 40 years trying to erase it from the registry and had not quite succeeded. The entry was dated 31 years ago. She was 23. She was still holding the vellum when she heard the archive door open. She turned. Essa stood in the doorway, and behind her, filling it, was Aldrath. She said, because she could not think of anything else, "You knew." He said, "I knew what my predecessor had done. I found his private records 8 months ago. I needed someone who could work the archive without being told what to find, because anything I commissioned from inside the pack, Aldrich would have learned about before it was finished. A pause. I knew your name from those records. I did not know if you knew it. She looked down at the vellum in her hands. She said, I did not know this name. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, There's more, she said. Tell me. He crossed the room. He stood across the table from her and reached into his coat and placed another piece of vellum on the table between them. This one was newer. His handwriting. She recognized it now. The tight, angular script of a man who wrote under pressure and did not waste words. She read it. Her hands were steady. Her chest was making the low note again, the one she did not have a name for. It was not the buried lineage that made her hands still. She had already understood the lineage. It was the date at the top of the document. It was 8 months ago. He had started looking for her 8 months ago, before the Iron Winter, before Torm had found her copying documents in a rented room in the lower quarter. She looked up. He was watching her. She said, You could have simply told me. He said, You would not have believed me. You would have thought it was a claim, a manipulation, another use for an erased name. I needed you to find it yourself. She said, You hid the file. He said, I hid that one file. She looked at him for a long time. The fire in the hearth was burning properly now, full and steady, and the room was warmer than it had been all week. Essa had stepped back into the corridor and pulled the door to. The only sounds were the fire and the wind against the high windows. She said, Aldrich sent the recorder to get my certification yesterday. He said, I know. She said, He will not stop. Whatever he built, he will not let a registry entry undo it. He said, He will not be building anything else after today. The way he said it was quiet and total, the way a door closed by someone who had decided it was time. She understood there had been preparations made she was not privy to. She understood that while she had been working the archive, other things had been in motion, and that the 7 days had been a clock for more than her commission. She said, Show me what else is in the file. He turned the vellum over. On the back was a second document, a formal one, bearing a seal she recognized from the land grants, the Alpha King's private seal, the one used for documents outside the council record. It was a notation of claim, not a political claim, not a lineage claim. The phrasing was old and specific, drawn from a ritual form she had seen only in the oldest registry entries, the ones dating to the original Pack Foundation. It was a mate claim notation, the kind recorded when a bond was recognized, and the recognizing party wished it made part of the permanent record before any witness could contest it. The notation was dated 8 months ago. She put the vellum down. She pressed both palms flat on the table. She said, You could not have known, 8 months ago. He said, I could not have proven it. Knowing and proving are not the same thing. He paused. You smelled like home. I had not known what home smelled like until the moment I read your grandfather's name in my predecessor's private records and understood that someone had spent 40 years trying to make sure no one ever found you. She looked at her hands on the table. She said, I do not have a wolf. He said, You have a bloodline that predates the shift registry by 60 years. What you carry is not a wolf. He paused again, and she heard something in the pause that was not authority, but something older and more careful. What you carry is something the old records call a keeper's gift, a reading of bonds that bypasses the wolf entirely. I have been running this archive for 6 years. In 6 years, no one has read it the way you did in 7 days. She said, That is not proof of a bond. He said, No. She said, What is? He looked at her hands on the table, then at her face. He said, The fact that the fire has been burning at full heat since the moment you stopped being afraid in this room. She looked at the hearth. She had not added wood since the 3rd day. She had been adding wood every morning until then, and stopping herself from noticing that it did not need it. The door to the archive opened. It was not Essa. It was Aldrich, and behind him were two men she had not seen before, broad and watchful, wearing the insignia she had catalogued from the forged land grants. The council recorder Pell was not with him. She would learn later that Pell had gone to Essa an hour after leaving the archive the day before, and Essa had gone to the king's second-in-command, a man named Koren, who had spent the intervening hours doing something quiet and thorough in the lower levels of the keep. Aldrich looked at the vellum on the table. He looked at her. He said, "You should not have found that." She said, "You should have destroyed it." He said, "I needed it." He looked at Aldrath. "It was proof. Proof that your predecessor recognized the bloodline and chose to suppress it lawfully. The council precedent is clear. A suppressed line cannot be reinstated without a majority vote of the full council. You do not have a majority. You have not had one for 2 years." Aldrath said, "Corin." The archive door opened again, and Corin came through it with 4 of the king's guard, and the 2 men behind Aldrich stepped back instinctively before they caught themselves. Corin set a small bound ledger on the center table beside the vellum. He said, "Pell's testimony and the secondary ledger from the lower vault. Payments to Aldrich's private accounts from the 3 border intermediaries. 12 years of payments, commencing 3 months before the treaty that gave away the eastern villages." Aldrich went very still. Sable picked up the secondary ledger. She opened it. She had not seen this one. Corin had retrieved it from somewhere she had not been sent. She read quickly, efficiently, the way her father had taught her. Every figure, every name, every date. She set it down. She said to Aldrich, "You kept the vellum because the council precedent cut both ways. If the line was suppressed lawfully, you could use it. But if the suppression was found fraudulent, the precedent reverses. The fraudulent suppression makes the line not suppressed at all. Every registry entry, every land grant, every treaty session that rested on the line being gone, all of it unravels." She picked up the registry entry with her own name on it. "You needed this preserved because you needed the precedent. You did not destroy it because you thought no one would find the panel." She set it down. "I am very good at panels." Aldrich looked at her with the expression of a man who has watched his own architecture collapse and is trying to calculate whether any of it can be salvaged. She could see the calculation happening. She could see the moment it ended. He turned to the 2 men behind him. He said, very quickly, "Remove her." Neither man moved. They were looking at Aldrath. Aldrath said, "Leave." Both men left. Aldrich turned. He had one more move, and she saw it coming the way she saw everything coming, a fraction before it happened, and she moved without deciding to move, not toward the door, not away from the table, but sideways, because she had spent the last 7 days learning exactly where every surface in this room was, and one of the chests on the shelf to her left had a corner. She had been careful about all week. Aldrich's reach missed her arm and caught the edge of the chest instead, and the chest came down and he went down with it, and Aldrath was across the room before she had time to breathe. It was not a long fight. It was not a fight at all, really, in the sense of 2 parties exchanging force. It was the application of overwhelming decision. When it was over, Corin and 2 of the guard had Aldrich contained, and Aldrath was standing beside her, and she was aware of the warmth of him close on her right side, close enough that she could feel the heat from his arm without touching it, and that the low note in her chest had become something wider and deeper, something that pressed outward against her ribs as if it wanted more room than she had been giving it. She said, "That corner has been in the way all week." He looked at her. She saw it happen, the thing she had been watching for without admitting she was watching, the mask going down, not gradually, not in the careful, incremental way of the deniable cracks over the past 2 days, but all at once, the entire weight of the controlled stillness gone, And what was underneath was not the thing she had been half preparing herself for. It was quieter than that. It was a man looking at a woman the way a man looks when he has stopped pretending he is not looking. He said, "I would have caught him." She said, "I know. I was faster." Something crossed his face that she did not have a word for. He said, "I believe you." In the days that followed, the council convened and the ledger Pell had found was entered into the record. 3 of the 5 council members had not known. 2 had. The 2 who had known were removed in the same session. The Eastern land grants were voided. The treaty sessions were reopened. The border villages sent representatives to Keld Crossing for the first time in 12 years, which they would not have done for a land dispute alone, only for something that felt like the ground shifting and settling into a shape they could trust. The registry entries bearing the scratched names were reinstated one by one, a process Sable organized, which took considerably longer than 7 days, but which she was not being asked to complete under a commission. Aldrich faced the full council in the great hall of the keep, before the assembled pack, the border village representatives, and Pell, who had brought his recorder's bag and used it. The testimony was exact and thorough. The evidence was the ledger, the secondary payments, the land grant ghost impressions, and the testimony of 6 wolves who had been paid for silence and who, when the payment stopped being silent. When it was done, Aldrich was stripped of his chain of office in the same hall where he had first put it around his neck 7 years ago, before witnesses, and the stripping was as public as the original investiture. It was not a small end. It was a commensurate one. On the night of the final council session, after the chamber had cleared and the lamps were being brought low, Aldrath found her in the archive. She was reinstating the 46th scratched name, working by a single lamp, her handwriting as precise at the end of a long day as it was at the beginning. He came in and stood across the table from her, and she kept writing because there was one more line to finish, and she finished it. She looked up. He said, "You have one more thing to find." She said, "The file." He reached into his coat. He set it on the table between them. She had not seen the outside of it before, only the vellum she had extracted from the panel. The file was a small thing, tied with cord, the knot a specific kind she recognized from the oldest registry bindings, the kind used for records that were meant to persist. She untied it. Inside the vellum was a second paper she had not seen, a single handwritten page in a different script from his, older. The penmanship of someone working from a tradition she knew had ended before the Iron Winter. It was a letter from his predecessor to an unnamed recipient, written in the year before his death. It described the bloodline, its history, its dispersal across 3 packs and 2 human settlements when the old Alpha had panicked and tried to scatter it so no one could reassemble the claim. It described what the bloodline carried. Not power in any martial sense, not strength, not shift speed, but the keeper's gift, the ability to read the bonds in a room the way a compass reads north, to know what was true and what was performed before any word was spoken. The old Alpha had feared it because a keeper could not be deceived in her own domain. She had to be removed from it. That was what the scratched names had been. In the end, not an erasure of people, but the removal of a gift the hierarchy had not been able to manage. She read it twice. She set it down. He said, "There was one more thing I did not put on the shelves." She said, "You did not trust me to find it the way I found the rest." He said, "I trusted you to find it. I did not trust myself to be in this room when you did." She looked at him. She said, "You were in this room on the 5th day." He said, "I needed to know if you could look at me the way you look at a document, without deciding what you wanted to see first." She thought about that. She thought about the evenings of the 5th day and the 6th day, when he had stood in the doorway or at the far end of the shelves, in the places a man stands when he is trying to be invisible in a room he runs, and how she had kept working because she had been taught that the work mattered more than the watching, and how she had noticed him anyway, every time, the way she noticed everything, without meaning to, and without being able to stop. She said, "You are not very invisible." He said, "No." She said, "The fire." He said, "The fire." She looked at the lamp on the table. The flame was steady, not guttering, full without reason given the hour and the cold coming through the window joints. She pressed her hand flat on the table beside the vellum. The low note in her chest was there, and she let it be there, let it widen, and something answered it in the room, a warmth that came from no single source, that had been building since the 5th day, and that she had been explaining to herself in other terms for 3 days now. She said, "I have not finished restoring the registry." He said, "I know." She said, "It will take another 3 weeks at minimum." He said, "I had calculated 4." She said, "I am faster than you expected." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Yes, you are." He reached across the table. His hand came to rest over hers on the vellum, not covering it, just alongside, the edge of his thumb against the edge of her hand, and she felt the warmth pass through that small point of contact, the way heat passes through stone that has held it all day, steady and deep, and nothing like the spark she had braced for. She did not move her hand. He said, with nothing in his voice but the fact of it, "I am not going to ask you to decide tonight." She said, "I know." She said, "I am going to finish the registry entry I was on when you came in." He said, "All right." He moved to the chair at the end of the table, not to the door, not to a respectful distance. The chair at the end of the table, the one she had been keeping her coat on. He moved the coat carefully and draped it over the arm and sat down, and she pulled the lamp closer and picked up her pen. And the archive was quiet except for the scratch of the pen and the fire that burned on with no wood added, and no reason to keep burning except that it did. She finished the entry. She started on the next. Outside, the iron winter held the river in its locked grip, and the cold pressed against the stone walls of the keep. And inside the archive the warmth did not waver, and the lamp did not gutter, and the 47th scratched name came back into the record, and then the 48th, while the King of Keld sat at the end of the table and watched a woman work, and did not pretend he was not watching. Essa checked the archive door at the 3rd hour and saw the light still showing under it, and went back to her post without disturbing anything. By dawn, the registry was 62 names long and growing. By the end of the following month, it would be complete, and the names would hold, and the land along the eastern ridge would go back to the families that had worked it before the grants were written, and the border villages would have their treaty revised in open council, and the keeper's gift would have a name again in the formal records of Keld Crossing, recorded in a hand so precise that no one who came after would be able to doubt what it said. The iron clasp in her hair caught the first light when she finally stood and stretched. He was asleep in the chair, his head back and his hands open on the armrests, the stillness of him completely different in sleep, unguarded in a way she thought he probably was not in many rooms. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the file. She thought about the 8 months he had spent looking for her name, and the 7 days she had spent finding it, and the one piece of vellum behind a panel she had found only because the wood grain was wrong. She gathered her notebook. She set it on the table beside the file. He had hidden one file from her. She had found it anyway. She thought that was probably how it was going to be, going forward, and she found she did not mind. The fire in the hearth burned on, warm and steady, keeping itself. 3 weeks into the registry restoration, Pell came to her with a secondary index he had found in the lower vault, a listing of the scratched names cross-referenced to territorial maps that suggested the bloodline had dispersed along specific routes. rather than randomly. She said she would find it very useful. They worked side by side for 2 hours, and she understood by the end of the 2 hours that Pell was 20 years old and had gone to S, not because he was brave, but because the thing Aldrich had asked him to certify had been specific enough that he could see exactly what it was, and he was not the kind of person who could see a thing exactly and pretend he had not. She told him the index was good work. Essa came to the archive on the 5th morning of the 2nd week with 2 bowls of grain porridge and a pot of Hill Settlement root tea. She set the tray down without comment and turned to leave. Sable said thank you. Essa stopped at the door. She said, without turning. He came down the first night and stood outside the door for an hour. I saw him from the gatepost. She paused. He does not stand outside doors? She left. Sable looked at the door for a moment. Then she pulled the tray closer and poured 2 cups and left one at the end of the table in the chair where his coat had been. He came to the archive every evening, not always to speak. Sometimes he brought documents from the council chamber that needed a second reading from someone who had not already made up her mind about their meaning. Sometimes he sat in the chair at the end of the table and read his own correspondence while she worked. And the archive was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when the 2 people in them have nothing they need to prove to each other. On the 9th evening, he said, without looking up from what he was reading, that the families on the eastern ridge had begun returning to their holdings. She said that was faster than she had expected. He said, "You are not the only one who is faster than expected." She looked up. He was still reading. She went back to work. On the night she finished the registry, she sat for a long time after the last entry was complete, the pen still in her hand. The registry was 104 names long, 46 years of erasure, and the names were back, and they would hold. She heard him before she saw him. The door. The change in the room. He crossed to the table and looked at the open registry. He read the last entry twice. He placed his hand flat on the open page beside it. She placed her hand beside his. The lamp flame burned without trembling, the way it had all winter, from the moment she had stopped being afraid in this room. She picked up the vellum from the panel. She had kept it on the table throughout the restoration, not filed away, but visible, where she could see it while she worked. The name on it was hers, crossed through 7 times, still legible. She looked at it for the last time. He said, "You are the keeper of this archive. There is a title for it in the old registry language, and it is not a servant's title." He paused. "Stay." She set the vellum down and turned to a fresh page. She wrote her name in the keeper's notation, the one her father had taught her, the one she had never had a use for until now. She wrote it clearly, without hedging, the way her father had taught her to write anything she meant to stand. She handed him the pen. He took it. He signed beneath her name in the tight, angular script she had memorized from 8 months of his documents. He set the pen down. He looked at what they had written. He said, "Witnessed." She said, "Witnessed." Outside, the iron winter was beginning, very slowly, to ease. The river at Keld Crossing had not cracked since the first week of the season, and in the mornings the air from the ridge carried a note of earth beneath the frost that meant the ground was considering something else. It would take weeks more before anything broke fully open, but it had begun, the way things begin, in a room where the right 2 people were finally in the same place at the same time, and the records showed it, and the fire knew it had been true all along.